Picking up from our previous discussion on historical fields as structures and processes, let's delve into how Hegel actually conceptualized the grand narrative of world history. He starts by contrasting two fundamental ways of seeing the world. Think of the Romans. They were all about what he called metonymy, basically, things connected by proximity or contiguity. Their reality was a raw field of force, think legions marching, roads stretching across landscapes. But their ideal, a meticulously ordered system, especially in time, ancestors' inheritance and space, roads, armies, proconsuls. The irony? They ended up trapped by this very worldview, unable to reconcile the brute force of reality with their formal ideals. Then comes Christianity, which flips the script entirely. It says forget conquering space and time through sheer force, forget those neat formal relationships. Instead, it sees the world as part of a metaphor, where the real meaning, the dominant term, comes from another realm, God's world. Christianity actively seeks to transcend the whole messy business of ideal versus reality that plagued the Roman approach. Okay, so how does Hegel use these different ways of seeing the world, metaphor, metonymy, synecdo, to map out history? He argues that history unfolds through distinct phases, each characterized by a particular mode of consciousness. Think of it like a psychological development arc for humanity. First, savagery. This is the stage where there's no real separation between humans and nature. Life is dictated by custom. There's no sense of individual rights clashing with tradition. No abstract goals, just an endless present, repression instead of morality, and the strong rule the weak. Then the transition to Oriental civilizations, think Egypt, Mesopotamia, India. This is where consciousness awakens to metaphor. It's about recognizing the difference between the familiar self and the unfamiliar other, the known and the unknown. These early civilizations are essentially living metaphors. Next up, Greece, adolescence. Here, the focus shifts to the ideal as individuality. Think Socrates, Plato, the emphasis on the self-contained rational individual. This is a kind of metonymical reduction, focusing intensely on the part. But, as Hegel notes, this intense focus made Greek civilization bloom spectacularly fast, only to fade just as quickly. It lacked the principle to sustain that unity. Finally, Rome. This is maturity, manhood. Rome grasped synekdoche, the relationship between part and whole, but only formally, abstractly. Think duty, power, might. It's about the individual sacrificing for the general aim, realizing themselves only within that larger structure. This seriousness marks the transition to a more mature, albeit potentially rigid, form of consciousness. Now, here's where it gets really dramatic. Hegel sees these historical phases not just as static periods, but as acts in a classical tragedy. Think of the structure, pathos, the initial state, the feeling of things, like the raw condition of savagery or the unified but unself-conscious East. Then agon, the conflict, the struggle, the rise. This is Greece, the assertion of individuality, the clash of ideas. And finally, sparagmos, the tearing apart, the fragmentation. This is Rome, the attempt to impose order leading to its own breakdown, creating the conditions for the next act. But here's the twist. Unlike classical tragedy, which ends with a grim revelation of fate or justice, Hegel says history doesn't resolve in this tragic way. The ultimate resolution, the anagnorisis, isn't about accepting a harsh cosmic law. Instead, it's framed within the Christian vision, what he calls the comic vision. This vision promises ultimate liberation and reconciliation, moving beyond the limitations of the tragic phase. The tragic struggles, the agon and sparagmos, are necessary steps, but they are ultimately enclosed within a larger, more optimistic perspective. So, if it's not natural decay, what is maturity in history? For Hegel, it's not about getting old and slowing down like nature. History, he insists, is spirit, and maturity means achieving a kind of strength and unity, glimpsed in that Christian idea of reconciliation. Think of it as moving beyond the confines of classical tragedy, even beyond classical comedy, which was just about life asserting itself against fate. The Christian vision, like Dante's Divine Comedy, offers a grander picture. Everything finds its proper place in the hierarchy of being. It's a resolution, a harmonious ending. But wait. Even this Christian vision, for all its optimism, is still fundamentally metaphorical. It's pointing towards truth, but it's not the full truth itself. To truly grasp the whole process, to articulate the absolute, requires going back through the agon and sparagmos, the struggle and conflict with the world. This leads us into the complex dynamics of Western Europe. This brings us to the heart of Western history, the period Hegel was writing about, the Age of Revolution. He saw this as the culmination of that agonistic phase where nations had broken apart, asserting their own identities. But crucially, they also carried within them the principles for their own coherence and their connections to each other. Think of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, intense conflict, but also laying the groundwork for new forms of political organization. Hegel believed this process pointed towards a future unification of humanity with its own essence, freedom and reason. The ultimate goal? Perfect freedom equals perfect reason, which is the absolute truth, nothing less than life itself fully understood. His own time with its revolutions and nation building represented the peak of this struggle. Looking ahead, he could only speculate about future states, perhaps America or Russia, but his analysis was firmly rooted in what had already happened and was happening. The key insight? These future forms would inevitably have to pass through the same stages of consciousness, intelligence, emotion, will that we've seen in the past. The internal dynamics of any single phase reflect the dynamics of the whole historical process. Let's zoom in on one of those phases, Oriental history. Hegel argues that even within this vast period, we can see the same four-act drama playing out. It starts with a break from the mythic, savage past, when consciousness begins to sense a gap between itself and the world. From there we get four subphases, each representing a different attempt to impose order. First, China. Pure subjectivity, the emperor identified with the state, the political subject, through metaphor. Everything blends together, no clear lines between public and private, moral and legal. It's a theocratic despotism. Second, India, the unity breaks down. Society becomes a collection of separate parts, castes, ruled by a theocratic aristocracy. This is metonymy causal separation. There's constant tension, a restless shifting between extremes, a kind of chaos born from trying to reconcile an abstract god with sensual nature. Third, Persia, an attempt at synecdoche, grasping the spiritual principle. But here spirit is still seen materially, as the beneficial sun shining equally on all. It creates a formal unity, allowing parts like the Jews to develop without immediately shattering the whole. Finally, Egypt, the irony kicks in. The separation between spirit and matter becomes painful, anxiety-inducing. The contradictions become a riddle, a puzzle that Egypt couldn't solve. Think of the Sphinx. The solution? That's the job for the next act. So wrapping this up, the core idea is that the dynamics we see in any single phase of history, like Oriental history, mirror the dynamics of the entire historical process. The different ways we apprehend the world, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, are tools used to eventually reach irony, that critical awareness of our own limitations. Science, for instance, hits this wall because we're stuck inside history. But we can glimpse the form of the truth beyond. Harmony, reason, freedom, the unity of consciousness and being. This ideal is hinted at in religion, painted in art, described in science, philosophically grasped, and ironically reflected upon in historical consciousness itself. The justification for pushing forward, despite knowing we can never fully know, comes from art's comic vision, affirming the whole chaotic process as meaningful. And this historical consciousness, born with history itself, constantly reflects on itself, driving progress across all domains of knowledge and understanding. That's the essence of Hegel's grand, dramatic, and ultimately hopeful view of history.